This week in our broadcasts, Calcutta burned. A prosecutor lay dead in a Chicago street. A young aviatrix fell from the sky. Henry Ford rewrote the American work week. And as the week ended, Britain held its breath. Today, the stories behind the news. Today, we show you what came next.
On Monday, April 26, 1926, the city of Calcutta entered its fourth week of communal violence. It had begun in early April with a dispute between Hindu and Muslim communities in the city's poorer neighborhoods. By the end of the month, more than 100 lay dead. Nearly 1,000 had been wounded. British military regiments patrolled the streets with bayonets fixed. The viceroy in Delhi blamed agitators. Local clergy blamed each other. The British press in London barely covered it at all. A young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi was watching from his ashram in Gujarat. He had spent the previous 5 years building a movement of nonviolent resistance to British rule. He made no public statement that week. He was thinking. Within 4 years, he would lead the Salt March, walking 240 miles to the Arabian Sea to defy the British monopoly on salt. The image of a 61-year-old man bending to scoop seawater would travel around the world. The British Empire had ruled India for nearly 2 centuries. It had built railways, irrigation canals, and a civil service. It had also presided over famines that killed millions, extracted wealth that historians now estimate in the tens of trillions, and broken every promise of self-rule it had made during the Great War. In 1926, 400 million people lived under the Union Jack. Most British observers expected they would do so for another century. Calcutta itself would burn again in 1946 in violence that made 1926 look small. And the city the British had called the second city of the empire would become Calcutta, capital of an independent state. On Tuesday, April 27th, a black touring car pulled up outside a saloon in Cicero, Illinois. From inside, 4 gunmen opened fire with Thompson submachine guns. They emptied 1,000 rounds in under a minute. 3 men lay dead on Western Avenue when the smoke cleared. One of them was William McSwiggan, 26 years old, an assistant state's attorney for Cook County, known in the Chicago papers as the hanging prosecutor for his record of securing convictions against organized crime. The man who ordered the killing was Alphonse Capone, 27 years old. He did not know McSwiggan was in the car he targeted. The intended victims were rival gangsters who had been drinking with McSwiggan earlier that evening, for reasons that were never fully explained. Capone vanished after the shooting. Police searched for months. He was never charged. In 1926, he was arguably the most powerful man in Chicago. His organization controlled bootleg liquor distribution across the Midwest. Federal investigators estimated his annual revenue in the tens of millions of dollars, money that arrived in cash and left no paper trail. He had reached this position because of one law. The 18th Amendment, ratified in 1920, had made the manufacture and sale of alcohol illegal in the United States. It had not stopped Americans from drinking. It had simply transferred the alcohol economy from licensed brewers and distillers to men like Capone. 5 years after the McSwiggan killing, in October 1931, Capone would be convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The murder of a prosecutor, the violence in the streets, the extortion of small businessmen, none of it would ever be successfully prosecuted. He went down for unpaid taxes on income from a trade the law itself had created. He served 7.5 years, much of it in Alcatraz. Syphilis, contracted years earlier, had begun to destroy his mind. By the time he was released in 1939, he was no longer capable of running anything. He retired to his estate in Florida and spent the next 8 years declining into dementia. He died in 1947 at the age of 48, broken, his organization absorbed by the men who had once worked for him. Prohibition itself ended in 1933. The criminal infrastructure it built did not. The networks Capone had assembled, the corrupt police, the bribed politicians, the disciplined supply chains, would survive Prohibition's repeal and pivot into other illegal markets. The American mafia of the next half-century was, in significant part, built on the foundations laid in the 1920s. On Friday, April 30th, an aircraft fell from the sky over Jacksonville, Florida. The pilot was Bessie Coleman. She was 34 years old, the first Black American woman in history to hold a pilot's license. She had been born in Texas in 1892, the 10th of 13 children. Her father was Cherokee. Her mother had been born into slavery. As a girl, she picked cotton. She walked 4 miles each way to a one-room schoolhouse for Black children. She read every book she could find. When the Great War ended and she heard returning pilots tell their stories, she decided she wanted to fly. Every American flight school refused her. She taught herself French, sailed to Paris, and earned her wings at the École d'Aviation des Frères Caudron in 1921. She came home a celebrity in the Black press and an unknown in the white one. For 5 years, she barnstormed across America, performing aerial stunts for crowds who paid to see her fly. She refused to perform for segregated audiences. She refused to enter through doors marked colored only. She dreamed of opening a flight school for young Black aviators. On the morning of April 30th, she was rehearsing for an exhibition the next day. Her mechanic was at the controls. She was in the passenger seat without a safety belt, leaning out to study the field below. A loose wrench left in the engine compartment jammed the controls. The plane went into a dive at 2,000 feet. She was thrown from the cockpit and fell to her death. 10,000 mourners would line the streets of Chicago for her funeral on the South Side. The schools she dreamed of would not exist for another 2 decades. In 1939, the civilian pilot training program was established as part of the United States preparation for war. After lobbying by Black aviators inspired by Coleman's example, the program was opened to Black students at 6 historically Black colleges. The instructors at those programs would form the core of what became, in 1941, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. The Tuskegee Airmen flew over 15,000 combat sorties in the Second World War. They escorted bombers over Berlin and Rome and Munich. They were credited with shooting down more than 100 enemy aircraft. They were, by every measure, among the most decorated and successful pilots in the United States military. They had been trained in programs that existed because Bessie Coleman had insisted 20 years earlier that Black Americans could fly. She is buried in Lincoln Cemetery in Chicago. Every year on the anniversary of her death, Black aviators fly in formation over her grave and drop flowers. They have been doing this since 1931. The next day was Saturday, May 1st, International Workers' Day. Across Europe, red banners flew over Berlin and Vienna and Paris. In Moscow, 1 million workers marched through Red Square. In Warsaw, 5 Polish socialists died in clashes with communists during May Day demonstrations. In Detroit, Henry Ford made an announcement. Effective immediately, every factory worker in Ford's employ would labor only 40 hours each week, 8 hours a day, 5 days, Saturday off, Sunday off. No reduction in pay. It was the invention of the weekend. The Wall Street Journal called it an affront to the American work ethic. Other industrialists called Ford a fool, a socialist, a man destroying the very capitalism that had made him rich. Ford did not care. He had made his calculation. His workers, he said, would now have time to spend the money he paid them. They would buy automobiles. They would take Sunday drives. They would visit relatives in the next town. They would create demand for the products his factory built. The 40-hour week, in Ford's mind, was not a concession to labor. It was a strategy to build the consumer economy. 12 years later, in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act passed Congress. It established the 40-hour workweek as American law. It also established the federal minimum wage, prohibited most child labor, and required overtime pay for hours beyond 40. President Roosevelt signed it on June 25th. It was the last major piece of New Deal legislation and one of the most consequential laws in American history. Within a generation, every major industrialized nation had followed. France adopted the 40-hour week in 1936, Britain in 1947, Germany and Japan in the post-war Reconstruction. By 1970, the two-day weekend was simply assumed to be how the modern world worked. The leisure economy that emerged, the suburbs, the family car, the Sunday drive, the vacation, the weekend hobby, was built on the bargain Ford struck in May 1926. He had not been trying to be generous. He had been right about consumer demand. The weekend was real. So was the world he was helping to build. By Sunday, May 2nd, the United Kingdom stood on the edge of the first general strike in its history. The story had been building for months. In Britain's coal industry, 1 million men faced a wage cut and a longer working day. The mine owners said the British coal industry could not compete with German coal on the world market without the cuts. The miners had heard the same argument in 1921, and 1922, and 1924, and they had absorbed every wage reduction the owners proposed. Their slogan was simple: not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day. On the morning of Sunday, May 2nd, the last talks between mine owners and union leaders collapsed at number 10 Downing Street. By Sunday afternoon, the country was bracing. At 1 minute to midnight on Monday, May 3rd, 1,700,000 workers would walk out in solidarity with the miners. Railwaymen, dockers, printers, iron and steel workers, transport workers. Volunteers reported to government depots. The Royal Navy stood ready at the great ports. The BBC, barely 3 years old, prepared to be the only broadcasting voice the public could hear during the week ahead. The strike began at midnight. It collapsed 9 days later. The Trades Union Congress called it off on May 12th without consulting the miners, who continued to fight alone. By November, economic necessity had driven most of them back to work, on the original terms of the lockout: lower wages, lower hours, the exact thing they had struck against. It was the most decisive defeat of the British labor movement in modern history. The lessons learned by both sides reshaped Britain. The ruling class learned it could break a strike with volunteers, a state-controlled broadcaster, and a cabinet willing to use emergency powers. The unions learned that solidarity had limits the law would not respect. Britain would not see another general strike for the rest of the 20th century. 5 stories, 1 week. April 26th through May 2nd, 1926.
This has been a dispatch from the week of April 26th through May 2nd, 1926. That was the news of the world from this past week.